Table saw or miter saw? Which one? After 50 years of woodworking, it's still hard to say. I've used both more times than I can count. So today I'll break down their key differences for you so that I can help you decide which one is the best fit for your shop and the type of woodworking that you do. As a starting point, it might be useful to look at what these tools were created for. Where do we get them from, okay? The miter saw actually started out as a hand tool, and it was a miter box with a back saw. And carpenters, specifically trim carpenters, would use it for cutting off trim, either making mitered corners or square corners. So we're talking here about casing around doors, baseboard, even cove molding. And they would do that all by hand cutting once upon a time. The miter saw was created to give them a more efficient way of doing it. It's faster and easier to do it with a powered saw, obviously, than it is to do it with a manual saw. The other tool that could have done that job was the radial arm saw, which existed long before the miter saw did, but the radial arm saw is large and heavy and rather difficult to move to job sites. It's great in a shop, it's great in a factory, but in a job site, it's not so convenient. Okay, so that's where the miter saw came from. It was actually developed to be a carpentry tool, but it's been adopted by the woodworking community. And in doing that, we've kind of pushed the manufacturers of miter saws to improve upon their designs. And the miter saws we have available to us today are much better than the ones that were available to me back when I was doing carpentry work about 30 years ago. All right, so what about the table saw? Well, table saw, I can't even find how far back it goes because it goes a long way back. And the fact of the matter is that it's really a pretty universal saw. I mean, it's just a table with a saw blade sticking up through it, okay? Really, the design can go all the way back to sawmills, and I'm talking about water-powered sawmills, some of which had huge circular blades. And it was essentially the idea, same idea, just on a much larger scale. Obviously, that was used for turning trees into planks, but people would also take the planks that they had bought and take them to their local sawmill to have them cut to size. And so that's the root of the table saw. It's always been considered a rather universal tool. And even now, I would have to say in our modern time, with all the jigs and sleds and fixtures that have been designed to go with the table saw, I would say it's more universal than it has ever been. So both tools have changed over time. The table saws have gotten both larger and smaller. Miter saws have gotten larger and more complex. And they're both very useful tools. Don't take anything I'm going to say as to say that one of them is really not worth having, okay? I will make a disclaimer here, though. I don't currently own a miter saw because I have a radial arm saw, and they essentially do the same thing. I don't have the room in my workshop to have both, and since I have a radial arm saw, which I've had for about 45 years, I really don't see any reason to also have a miter saw. Now, if I was doing work where I was, say, installing buildings in people's houses, and I was doing finished carpentry in people's houses, yeah, I would need a miter saw. I need something I could take with me. But here in my shop, I don't have one. So let's talk about miter saws first before we talk about table saws. The history of miter saws, or the evolution of miter saws, has been rather interesting as we look at how they've improved through the years. The original miter saw, we could almost think of it as a circular saw mounted to a swivel base that allowed it to go up and down. The base would also allow it to swivel this one way or another. You could lock it in an angle. That's called a single bevel miter saw. In the original miter saws, that's all they did. So you could do a 90-degree cut, you could do a 45-degree cut, you could do any angle from 0 to 45 degrees to either side. And that was really pretty good for a lot of carpentry work. Well, that wouldn't take long for them to realize that that wasn't enough. They needed to be able to do crown molding. Now, crown molding, and this isn't actually crown molding, but this is cut like crown molding. This is actually particle board. When you've got outside corners, you have to be able to do what's known as a compound cut. And it's compound because there's angle in two directions, okay? We've got an angle this way and an angle this way. A standard miter saw can't do that. To be able to do that, you have to have what's known as a dual bevel miter saw. What's the difference? Well, the dual bevel, not only does the saw allow the blade to swivel back and forth this way, but to tilt. And most of them just tilt to one side. It's usually the right side. Okay, there may be some that tilt to the left. I don't know. I haven't actually looked for that. So that's a dual bevel miter saw, and it does give us that capability to do the crown molding, the outside corners for crown molding. The inside corners are done differently. Okay, so that was a major improvement. And again, that's been around for quite a while. The more recent improvement is what we call a sliding dual bevel miter saw, or a lot of people just refer to it as a sliding miter saw. As far as I know, all the sliding miter saws out there are dual bevel, but don't quote me on that, I may be wrong. But the idea is that not only does the blade move up and down, but you can pull it forward, kind of like a radial arm saw, except for not the same distance, nowhere near as big a distance. What does that do for us? Well, that allows us to cut wider material. A standard miter saw, which might have a 10-inch or 12-inch blade, can do fine cutting, say, 3-inch, 4-inch material. But what if you want to cut a 2x8 or a 2x12? Well, the blade isn't big enough. To do a 2x12 on a standard single bevel miter saw, you probably have to have about a 16-inch blade on there, okay? Maybe, so that, that's getting really big, it's getting really heavy. So the slide is a rail that the head that holds the motor and the blade is on, allows it to come forward, you can bring it down, and then actually you cut going back in with it is the proper way to cut. Now this gives you some other great capabilities as well. And that, for one thing, is that you can make a cut to depth, because you can put a depth stop in there, make a cut to depth. So you could take this board, for example, and if we want to do a half lap joint, we could set the depth so that it stops at that halfway point, and we can make a bunch of cuts on this surface, cutting it down to half its thickness. Now we'd have to clean it up a little bit, but that's not unusual. People do that all the time on a table saw. But the advantage of doing it on a miter saw, sliding miter saw, is you can see what you're doing. If you're doing it on a table saw, the cut is underneath and it's blind. You're cutting it by faith, okay? Yeah, I set the saw up right. I believe I'm cutting it right, but you can see if you're cutting it right if you're doing it with that sliding miter saw. So that's a big advantage, okay? Opens up a lot of capability there when it comes into using it for joinery. That's one of the big pluses that's come out with the sliding miter saws, in addition to the fact that they can do wider material. So you've got a stop for the depth, you've got stops for angles, and then a lot of people take them and they'll mount them to a table, extend the fence on either side, and now they've got a long fence for it, so they can set stop blocks and they can do repetitive cuts of a number of different pieces of the same size. Now, you can do that without building the big table, just by, for shorter pieces, as long as the fence is on the saw. But if you want to be able to do big pieces, say you need to do, a bunch of 4-foot long pieces, you would need obviously a longer fence. So a lot of people that are woodworkers will set that up in their workshop, and they'll have their sliding miter saw permanently mounted somewhere to a workbench against a wall, where they've got lots of room to spread the material out, run the material back and forth, make their cuts. And it's a very quick way of cutting off a bunch of dimensional material to size. Okay, so if you're working with, say, a lot of 1x4s, 1x2s, 2x4s, 2x6s, whatever, in a project, and you need to make a lot of cuts, that's a really convenient, fast way of doing it, and doing it with some precision and accuracy. Modern miter saws also give you the ability to dial in the precision of the angle, okay? It comes factory set, but there is an adjustment there so that you can set your 90 degrees to be exactly 90 degrees. That's an important feature to have, because things can happen, okay? Shocks, vibration can cause it to go out. This allows you to reset your saw from time to time and keeps your accuracy up. And that's important, especially for joinery. With all this great capability we've got in the miter saw, there are limitations. You can't really use a miter saw for ripping material. It's really a crosscut saw. That's about all it does, okay? It does that extremely well, but it really can't do ripping. Now, a radial arm saw, yes, can be used to rip, but a lot of people don't like to use it for ripping, and I'm one of them. Even though I have one, I've had it for years, because there's a lot of potential danger if you don't do it right, okay? Now remember, any power tool is dangerous if you don't do it right, okay? A lot of people don't like radial arm saws because they say they're dangerous. Well, okay, there is some danger factor there. And I would have to say the miter saw is probably a safer saw overall than the radial arm saw, partially because you can't do those rip cuts. all right? And partially because of the way you run the blade through the material, there isn't that risk of the blade trying to pull itself through the material faster than you want it to. So there's our miter saw. It's an excellent tool, a lot of capability, but I'll say right now, if you're going to spend the money on a miter saw, you don't want to buy a cheap one because you're going to find the limitations will be frustrating. All right, now let's take a look at table saws. Now, I have a table saw here in my workshop, and it's probably one of the tools I use the most, partially because of the flexibility of the table saw, and partially just because there's things that you got to cut. You know, most projects start out with cutting up lumber, and the table saw is a good place to do a lot of that work. Now, table saws have gotten both larger and smaller since, say, when I was a kid learning about woodworking, okay? You can find professional table saws, cabinet saws that are huge, that have a table that extends 8 feet that way and 8 feet that way, or maybe it's that way, I don't know, that are used in cabinet shops and furniture shops to cut up sheets of plywood. If that's what you're doing, that's great. If you can afford it, you have the room for it, that's wonderful. Most woodworkers obviously don't have that. Most of us are limited to fairly small saws. Going on the smaller end, we get into what are known as portable contractor saws. Now, this saw is actually considered a portable contractor saw. It's got a base with wheels. Then you fold the base up, and it's kind of like a hand truck. You can take it off, load it in the back of your truck, take it to a job site. But as portable contractor saws go, this is a pretty large one. It's much larger than the saw I had previously, which was also considered a portable contractor saw. Generally speaking, the larger saws tend to be more accurate, more precise, than the smaller ones. They have a cast iron table, whereas this one is just cast aluminum. The fences are more solid and straighter, but of course you're paying for that. You know, those saws tend to be more expensive. A lot of woodworkers, a lot of home woodworkers, or especially new woodworkers, will end up buying a portable contractor saw of some type, or they may go on like Craigslist or the Facebook Marketplace and look for a used saw. There are a lot of old table saws, old Craftsman table saws you can find on there at a really good price. Okay, so the historic problem with table saws is that they weren't really good at cross-cutting. Now, table saws excel in ripping, okay, down the length of a board. You've got a fence here. You can set your fence to the blade at whatever distance you want. There's a scale here. If you want more accuracy, you can use a ruler. You can get it exactly how far you want. You can tilt the blade. So if you can get an angled cut. But your real limitation has always been this miter gauge. And this is, as miter gauges go, this isn't too bad, but it's still not that great. And the real issue here is that you've got essentially a protractor here with a needle, and you've got to set your angle there. And they just aren't very accurate, and they aren't very large. Okay, there's a couple solutions to this. Number one is to use a digital protractor to make sure you get it exactly right, which I do. Another is to go to an aftermarket fence, a larger aftermarket miter saw. This one, like this one, it's got, this particular model has got indentations here that are preset for various degrees, so you can get a very precise setting very quickly. A couple of manufacturers of larger saws, like SawStop, for example, have their own design of this, but there's also other aftermarket ones out there. And so that's how you overcome that problem. That's the basic way of overcoming that problem, is to go with a better miter gauge. But that gets expensive, okay? These aftermarket miter gauges are not cheap. But there's a couple other things we can do. I mentioned earlier the term, I believe I mentioned jigs and sleds, okay? Here's one of the most common sleds used on a table saw. This is just a crosscut sled. It's got two tracks here, which go into the miter slots on the table. And this fence is exactly 90 degrees to the blade. And so I can go ahead and cut off a bunch of material just like I could on a miter saw and be sure that's exactly 90 degrees. So that's convenient. A lot of woodworkers today that don't have a miter saw, this is the way they solve the problem, is by using something like this. It's actually very easy to work with. You can set up stop blocks on it. You can make it whatever size. This one's really not very big. You look at some woodworking channels online, and they'll have, of course, they'll have bigger table saws than I do. They have these huge crosscut sleds they've made, and they can cut something, you know, maybe 3 feet by 4 feet or something like that. And they're actually absolutely huge. This one's pretty small. Another variation on this is a miter sled. You see this triangular piece here. This is exactly 90 degrees. And what it does is it puts it so that my cuts are exactly 45 degrees, or my two sides of the fence here are exactly 45 degrees to the blade. So as long as I cut one piece of my corner, say I'm making a frame, for example, on this side, and another piece of my corner on this side, it's going to fit, okay? And this is a great way of expanding the capability of the table saw so that it can do some of what the miter saw does. And there's other types of things you can do. Here's one other I'm just going to show you. This is a tenon jig. If you want to make mortise and tenon joinery, you can clamp your piece here to do your tenon, and you can just cut your sides of your tenon here on the table saw instead of having to cut it by hand. So the addition of sleds and jigs has really expanded the utility of the table saw, allowing it to do much more than it could before. But again, it really boils down to the quality of your table saw. You want your table saw to be an accurate tool. And more than anything, that means a couple of things. That means that your your blade run out is true, and your fence is solid. Now fences are adjustable, and so you can make it exactly parallel to the blade, but you don't want it to be able to wobble back and forth when you slide it, okay? It needs to maintain that perpendicularity so that it is parallel to the blade. Any table saw, I don't care who manufactures it, I don't care what the price is, if it doesn't have that capability, it's not worth owning. Okay, so now we've looked at some of the differences between the miter saw and the table saw, some of the peculiarities of both of these saws, and I've tried to give you a pretty good picture of what they're capable of. And so now we're still back to our basic question: which one should you buy? And I really hate to tell people what they should buy. I'd rather you make your own decision. Obviously, I have my own preference here, and I have my own opinion, and I will tell you that, but I don't want you to buy it just because I'm saying so. Really, because you need to buy what's going to work for you, and what works for me may not be what's going to work for you. All right, so how do you know what's going to work for you? Well, it depends on the kind of projects you're going to do. If you're planning on doing projects that are pretty much all like 1x4s, and I've made a lot of projects out of 1x4s, or you're planning on doing a lot of remodeling of your home, you probably would be better off having a miter saw than the table saw. On the other hand, if you're going to do a lot of general type projects, bird houses, cutting boards, Christmas presents for the family, maybe some small furniture, knickknacks, stuff like that, then you're probably going to need the table saw. So it really depends largely on what projects you're going to do. If you're going to do cutting boards, you absolutely have to have a table saw. You can't do cutting boards with a miter saw. And so that's, it really depends on what you're going to do. As I've shown you, the table saw is able to do the miter cuts that the miter saw can do. And yes, it can do these compound miters as well. It's a little harder to set it up. You're going to take a little practice, but you can actually do it. I've done it on the table saw because the blade will tilt, and because you can set that angle like we use that miter sled, we can actually work it out so we can make these compound miter cuts that are necessary for cove molding, okay? It's not something I enjoy doing on the table saw, not something I'd want to do regularly, but it is possible to do, okay? So for most people, I would say, yes, a table saw is a better option, but don't buy it just on me saying that. Again, what is it that you're going to do? And buy the tool that's going to do what you need it to do the best.